The great bells of Aldermore Castle rang out across the kingdom, their deep bronze voices carrying news of the royal wedding through valleys and villages alike. Captain Marcus Thornfield stood at attention in the grand throne room, his ceremonial armor polished to a mirror shine, his hand resting firmly on the hilt of his sword. The weight of 3 generations of service pressed upon his shoulders, for his grandfather and father before him had served as guards to the crown, and he knew the traditions of this ancient hall better than the lines on his own palm. King Edmund stood before the gathered nobility, his crown catching the afternoon light that streamed through the stained glass windows. Beside him, draped in silk the color of midnight, stood Lady Eleanor Blackwood, soon to be his bride. She was a woman of considerable beauty and intelligence, though her family name carried no royal blood. This had caused whispers among the court, but Edmund had insisted. Love, he declared, transcended bloodlines. Marcus had served King Edmund for 15 years, since the young prince was barely old enough to hold a practice sword. He had watched Edmund grow from an eager boy into a thoughtful ruler, had stood guard through coronations and state dinners, through wars and treaties. In all that time, Marcus had never questioned an order, never wavered in his duty. But something about this day felt different, like the air before a storm. The ceremony was beautiful, filled with ancient words and sacred oaths. Lady Eleanor repeated the vows with a clear, steady voice that commanded respect. When the archbishop placed the crown of flowers upon her head, the temporary symbol that would be replaced in the weeks to come, the crowd erupted in applause. Marcus joined in the clapping, his gauntlets creating a metallic percussion that echoed against the stone walls. The feast that followed lasted well into the night. Long tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, fresh fruits, and delicacies from across the realm. Wine flowed freely, and musicians filled the air with joyous melodies. Marcus remained, on duty, positioned near the high table where the king and his new bride sat. He observed everything with the practiced eye of a man trained to spot threats and celebrations. But tonight there were only smiles and laughter. Eleanor moved through the crowd with grace, accepting congratulations and well wishes from nobles and servants alike. She had a gift for remembering names and faces, Marcus noticed. When she passed by his post, she paused to thank him for his service, her eyes meeting his with genuine warmth. He bowed deeply, offering the traditional words of loyalty. Yet even, in that moment, he felt the first stirrings of unease, though he could not name their source. In the days following the wedding, life in the castle settled into a new rhythm. Eleanor took to her role with enthusiasm, involving herself in matters of state and charity work among the common people. She established a hospital for the poor and reorganized the palace accounts to eliminate waste. The people began to speak of her kindly, calling her the common queen, for she had risen from lesser nobility to wear the crown. Marcus watched these changes with mixed feelings. On one hand, Eleanor was proving herself a capable and compassionate queen. On the other, certain courtiers had begun whispering about her ambitions, about how quickly she had gained influence over the king. Marcus dismissed such talk as jealousy, but the whispers persisted like moths around a flame. 3 weeks after the wedding, Lord Pemberton, the king's chief advisor, summoned Marcus to his chambers. The old man sat behind a desk piled high with parchments and ledgers, his face drawn with concern. He gestured for Marcus to sit, an unusual informality that immediately put the guard on alert. The advisor spoke in careful, measured tones about tradition and precedent, about the delicate balance of power in the kingdom. He explained that Queen Eleanor had been researching the royal archives, particularly documents concerning titles and ceremonies. Marcus listened, his soldier's instinct telling him that something significant was about to unfold, though he could not yet see its shape. That evening, as Marcus stood guard outside the royal chambers, he heard raised voices within. It was not an argument exactly, but a spirited discussion between the king and queen. He could not make out the words, but the tone suggested disagreement. This troubled him more than he cared to admit, for Edmund and Eleanor had seemed so united in the weeks since their marriage. The next morning brought an unexpected summons. All members of the royal guard were ordered to assemble in the throne room at midday. This was highly unusual outside of state ceremonies or emergencies. Marcus polished his armor with extra care, sensing that whatever was coming would test him in ways that battlefield valor never had. As he fastened his sword belt, he caught his reflection in the polished steel and barely recognized the worried expression on his weathered face. The throne room filled with guards, their armor creating a sea of glinting metal and proud insignias. Marcus took his place at the front, his rank as captain giving him prominence. King Edmund entered with Queen Eleanor at his side, both dressed in formal regalia. The king's expression was difficult to read, a mixture of determination and uncertainty that Marcus had rarely seen on his sovereign's face. Lord Pemberton stood to read a proclamation, his aged hands trembling slightly as he unfurled the scroll. The room fell silent, the only sound the crackling of torches in their sconces. Marcus felt his heartbeat quicken, every instinct screaming that the words about to be spoken would change everything. He straightened his shoulders, preparing himself for whatever duty would demand, never imagining that duty itself would soon become a question rather than an answer. Lord Pemberton's voice echoed through the throne room as he read from the royal proclamation. The assembled guards stood in perfect formation, their attention fixed on the elderly advisor whose hands shook slightly as he held the parchment. Marcus could see beads of sweat forming on Pemberton's forehead, despite the cool stone walls that surrounded them. The proclamation began with standard ceremonial language, praising the union of king and queen, celebrating the beginning of a new chapter in the kingdom's history. But then the words took an unexpected turn. Queen Eleanor, the document stated, would henceforth be known not merely as Queen Consort, the traditional title for those who married into royalty, but as Queen Sovereign, a title reserved throughout history for women who ruled in their own right. A murmur rippled through the assembled guards like wind through wheat. Marcus felt his jaw tighten. He had studied the histories, knew the ancient texts by heart. Queen Sovereign was not a title that could simply be granted by marriage or proclamation. It carried with it implications of equal rule, of shared sovereignty that went beyond companionship. It suggested power that tradition did not support. Lord Pemberton continued reading, his voice growing fainter as he outlined the ceremonies and protocols that would accompany this new designation. There would be a second coronation, a rewriting of certain state documents, an elevation of Eleanor's position in the order of succession. The changes were sweeping, fundamental alterations to the very structure of royal authority. When the reading concluded, King Edmund rose from his throne. His expression was resolute, though Marcus detected a hint of defensiveness in his posture. The king spoke of his love for Eleanor, of her wisdom and capability, of his desire to honor her not just as his wife but as his equal partner in governing the realm. His words were passionate, sincere, but they could not erase the weight of centuries of tradition. The king then asked for the traditional oath of recognition, the pledge that guards gave to affirm their loyalty to royal decisions. One by one, the guards were called to step forward and speak the ancient words. Marcus watched as his fellow soldiers approached the throne, kneeling to swear their acceptance. Some spoke firmly, others hesitated, but all complied. When Marcus's name was called, the room seemed to hold its breath. He stepped forward with measured steps, his boots echoing against the marble floor. Years of service, years of unwavering loyalty, brought him to this moment. He knelt before the throne as protocol demanded, his head bowed, his hand over his heart. But when the moment came to speak the oath, something inside him rebelled. Marcus lifted his head and met the king's eyes. In a clear, steady voice that carried to every corner of the chamber, he spoke words that no one expected. He pledged his loyalty to King Edmund, vowed to protect the throne with his life, promised continued service to the crown. But when it came to acknowledging the new title for Queen Eleanor, he stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. King Edmund leaned forward, confusion and disbelief crossing his features. He asked Marcus to repeat the oath to complete the pledge, but Marcus remained firm. He explained in respectful but unwavering terms that the title of Queen Sovereign was not recognized by the ancient laws of Aldermore. It was not a designation that could be claimed through marriage, not a rank that could be bestowed by proclamation alone. The throne room erupted into chaos. Nobles whispered urgently to one another. Guards shifted uncomfortably in their ranks, and courtiers looked between the king and his captain with wide eyes. Queen Eleanor's face remained composed, But Marcus saw her fingers tighten on the arm of her throne, her knuckles going white beneath her rings. The king demanded an explanation. His voice, usually so measured and kind, carried an edge of anger that Marcus had rarely heard. But the captain stood his ground. He spoke of the Book of Traditions, the sacred text that outlined every aspect of royal protocol. He cited specific passages, referenced historical precedents, explained that throughout the kingdom's 700-year history, the title of Queen Sovereign had been held by only 3 women, each of whom had inherited the crown in her own right. Lord Pemberton attempted to intervene, suggesting that traditions could evolve, that the king had the authority to define new titles and honors. But Marcus shook his head. The laws were clear. The title Queen Sovereign was not merely an honor or courtesy. It carried specific legal powers, certain rights of rule that could not be assumed without proper inheritance or election by the Council of Lords. Queen Eleanor finally spoke, her voice calm but ice-cold. She asked Marcus if he questioned her capability to rule, if he doubted her wisdom or dedication to the kingdom. The captain chose his words carefully. He assured her that his objection had nothing to do with her character or abilities. He would gladly serve her as queen consort, would defend her with his life, would honor her position as the king's chosen partner, but he could not recognize a title that law and tradition did not support. The king rose from his throne, his face flushed with emotion. He reminded Marcus of his years of service, of the bond between them, of the trust that had been built over decades. He asked his captain to reconsider, to think of the consequences of this refusal. But Marcus remained kneeling, his head bowed in respect but his resolve unshaken. A tense silence filled the chamber. Other guards began to shift nervously, unsure whether they should support their captain or distance themselves from his defiance. Some of the older soldiers, men who had served as long as Marcus, exchanged meaningful glances. They too knew the histories, understood the gravity of what was being proposed. King Edmund commanded Marcus to stand and dismiss the assembly. As the guards filed out, many cast backward glances at their captain, who remained kneeling before the throne. Marcus could feel the weight of every eye upon him, could sense the mixture of admiration and fear from his fellow soldiers. He had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, had set himself against the will of his sovereign in a way that demanded consequences. When the throne room had emptied of all but the royal couple and a handful of advisors, Marcus was ordered to rise. The king's expression had hardened into something Marcus had never seen directed at him before. There was hurt there and betrayal, but also a glimmer of understanding. Edmund knew his captain well enough to recognize that this defiance came not from disrespect, but from a deep conviction about the laws that held their kingdom together. As Marcus left the throne room, his armor suddenly felt heavier than ever before. He had served the crown faithfully for 15 years, had never wavered in his duty, had faced death itself without flinching. But now he faced something far more difficult than any battlefield. He faced the possibility that loyalty and law might not point in the same direction, that doing what was right might require him to stand against those he had sworn to serve. News of Marcus's refusal spread through the castle like wildfire. By evening, every servant, noble, and soldier knew what had transpired in the throne room. The barracks buzzed with heated discussions as guards debated the captain's decision. Some praised his courage in upholding tradition, while others called him a fool for defying the king's direct command. Marcus spent the night in his quarters, unable to sleep despite his exhaustion. He knew that morning would bring consequences he could not predict. Dismissal from service seemed certain, possibly imprisonment or exile. Yet even facing these possibilities, he felt no regret. The law was not something to be set aside when inconvenient, not even by kings who meant well. At dawn, a royal messenger arrived with a summons. Marcus was to appear before the Council of Lords at midday. This surprised him, as he had expected a private audience with the king, perhaps a formal dismissal. The involvement of the council suggested that his actions had elevated this matter beyond a simple dispute between sovereign and subject. The council chamber was an ancient room deep within the castle, its walls lined with portraits of past rulers and historic documents preserved under glass. 12 lords sat in their ceremonial robes, their faces grave as Marcus entered and took his place in the center of the room. King Edmund sat at the head of the table with Queen Eleanor at his right hand. Her expression was unreadable, carefully neutral. Lord Pemberton stood to present the case. He outlined the King's proclamation regarding the title of Queen Sovereign, explained the traditional oath of recognition, and then detailed Marcus's refusal to complete the pledge. The old advisor's voice trembled slightly, betraying his own discomfort with the proceedings. Marcus suspected that Pemberton privately agreed with his position but dared not say so openly. When invited to speak, Marcus chose his words carefully. He explained that his objection was not personal but legal. The title of Queen Sovereign carried specific constitutional implications that could not be granted by royal decree alone. He referenced the Charter of Rights established 4 centuries earlier, which clearly defined the powers and limitations of monarchy. The title in question would effectively create a co-monarchy without the proper legal framework. Several council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Lord Blackwood, Eleanor's uncle and one of the wealthiest nobles in the realm, spoke up forcefully in defense of the proclamation. He argued that the king had absolute authority to grant titles as he saw fit, that questioning royal prerogative was tantamount to treason. His words carried a thinly veiled threat that sent murmurs through the chamber. But Lady Ashford, the eldest member of the council and keeper of the royal archives, raised her hand for silence. In a voice weathered by age but still commanding, she spoke of precedent. She reminded the council of King Harold II, who had attempted to grant similar powers to his foreign bride 300 years ago. That decision had sparked a civil war that lasted a decade and nearly destroyed the kingdom. The chamber fell silent as Lady Ashford continued. She was not questioning the Queen's worthiness, she assured them, nor the King's love for his bride. But law existed precisely to protect the realm from well-intentioned mistakes. The title of Queen Sovereign had always required either direct inheritance of the throne or formal election by this very council. Without proper procedure, granting such a title could create legal chaos. Queen Eleanor finally spoke, her voice controlled but edged with steel. She addressed the council directly, bypassing Marcus as though he were beneath her notice. She spoke eloquently of her work for the kingdom, the hospitals she had established, the corrupt officials she had exposed, the improvements she had made to palace administration. Was she to be denied recognition simply because she had not been born royal? Her words were powerful, and several council members nodded in agreement. Marcus felt a pang of sympathy despite himself. Eleanor had indeed proven herself capable and dedicated, but capability was not the issue at hand. The question was whether personal merit could override constitutional law, whether even the best intentions justified setting aside the frameworks that protected everyone. Lord Stirling, the youngest council member and a scholar of constitutional law, requested permission to speak. He had brought with him the original Book of Traditions, its leather binding worn from centuries of consultation. He read passages that clearly outlined the specific requirements for the title in question. The law was unambiguous. The title of Queen Sovereign required more than royal proclamation or even council approval. It required amendment to the kingdom's founding documents, a process that involved not just the nobility, but representatives from every province. King Edmund's face grew darker with each word. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the stone floor. He accused the council of hiding behind dusty books and ancient fears, of refusing to recognize the changing times. His queen had earned her place at his side through action and deed, not through the accident of birth. Why should outdated traditions prevent him from honoring her appropriately? The argument that followed was unlike anything Marcus had witnessed in his years of service. King and council engaged in heated debate, voices rising and falling, tempers flaring and cooling. Some lords supported the king's position, moved by his obvious devotion to his queen. Others held firm to the legal arguments, unwilling to compromise the constitutional framework for any reason, however noble. Throughout it all, Marcus remained standing in the center of the chamber, a silent witness to the storm he had unleashed. He caught glimpses of Queen Eleanor watching him with an expression that mingled hatred and grudging respect. She understood, he realized, that his refusal was not rooted in prejudice or dislike. That made it more dangerous, for principles could not be negotiated away. As the sun began to set, painting the chamber in shades of amber and gold, Lord Pemberton called for order. A decision had to be made regarding Marcus himself. His refusal to complete the oath of recognition was technically insubordination, grounds for dismissal or worse. But it was also becoming clear that his position had support among the council's legal scholars. Lady Ashford proposed a compromise. Captain Thornfield would not be punished for his refusal, as he had acted according to his understanding of constitutional law. However, the matter of the title itself would be referred to a special commission of legal scholars and historians. This commission would review all relevant documents and precedents, then make a recommendation to the full council within 3 months. King Edmund looked as though he might reject this proposal outright, but Queen Eleanor placed a hand on his arm. She whispered something in his ear that Marcus could not hear. The king's jaw tightened, but he nodded curtly. The compromise was accepted, though clearly it satisfied no one completely. As the council adjourned, Marcus was dismissed with instructions to return to his regular duties pending the commission's findings. He bowed to the king and queen, then turned to leave. As he reached the door, he heard Queen Eleanor's voice behind him, cold and clear. She assured him that this matter was far from over, that she would not forget his role in questioning her rightful place. Marcus kept walking, knowing that he had made a powerful enemy, but unable to regret a choice that honored the law above personal safety. The special commission assembled within a week, gathering in the oldest part of the castle library where documents dating back to the kingdom's founding were preserved. Marcus found himself summoned to testify before the scholars, an experience that proved far more intense than any battlefield interrogation. They questioned him for hours about his knowledge of royal protocol, his understanding of the law, his reasons for refusing the oath. The commission was led by Professor Wilhelm, a historian from the Royal University, who had spent 40 years studying the kingdom's constitutional development. He was a small man with sharp eyes that seemed to see through any attempt at deception. As Marcus answered questions, the professor made careful notes, occasionally asking follow-up questions that revealed the depth of his expertise. During one session, Professor Wilhelm produced a document that Marcus had never seen before. It was a letter written by Queen Isabel I, one of only 3 women in history to hold the title of Queen Sovereign. The letter, penned nearly 500 years ago, described her own coronation and the legal requirements she had to fulfill before the title could be granted. Queen Isabel had been the eldest daughter of King Robert, inheriting the throne directly upon his death as there were no male heirs. But even with clear inheritance, she had been required to undergo a process of recognition that took nearly a year. She had traveled to all 12 provinces, meeting with local councils, demonstrating her knowledge of law and governance, proving her capability to rule. Only after this journey did the Council of Lords formally invest her with the title of Queen Sovereign. The professor read aloud from the letter, and Marcus felt vindicated by the words of this long-dead queen. Isabel herself had written about the importance of following proper procedure, of ensuring that power came with accountability and legitimacy. She had understood that titles were not merely ceremonial, but carried legal weight that affected the entire kingdom. Meanwhile, Queen Eleanor had not been idle. She launched her own campaign to win public support for the title change. She increased her charitable work, visiting villages and towns throughout the kingdom, speaking with common people about their concerns. Everywhere she went, she was received with warmth and admiration. The people loved her, and she made certain that news of this affection reached the ears of council members. Marcus watched these developments with growing concern. Eleanor was brilliant in her strategy, building popular support that made opposition to her seem elitist and out of touch. She gave speeches about the need for the kingdom to move forward, to leave behind outdated notions of birthright and embrace leadership based on merit. Her arguments were compelling, and many people began to question why she should be denied a title she seemed to deserve. The commission continued its work, examining documents from every era of the kingdom's history. They found the case of Queen Margaret, who had ruled as regent for her young son but never claimed the title of Queen Sovereign, despite wielding effective power for 15 years. They studied King Harold's failed attempt to elevate his foreign bride, learning how that decision had fractured noble alliances and sparked rebellion. One particularly revealing discovery came from the reign of King Thomas III. His beloved wife, Queen Catherine, had been widely admired for her intelligence and diplomatic skill. Thomas had wanted to grant her the title of Queen Sovereign as recognition of her contributions. But Catherine herself had refused, writing in her diary that accepting such a title without proper legal foundation would set a dangerous precedent that future generations might abuse. Marcus was granted access to the royal archives to assist the commission in their research. Spending long hours among ancient texts, he began to understand the deeper patterns of the kingdom's history. Every time constitutional procedures had been bypassed, even for good reasons, chaos had eventually followed. The law was not merely tradition for its own sake, but a hard-learned lesson from generations of mistakes. One evening, as Marcus was leaving the archives, he encountered Queen Eleanor in the corridor. She was alone without her usual retinue of attendants. For a moment they stood facing each other in the flickering torchlight. The hatred Marcus had seen in her eyes during the council meeting was gone, replaced by something more complex. Eleanor spoke first, her voice weary rather than angry. She asked Marcus if he truly believed she was unworthy of the title, if all her work for the kingdom counted for nothing in his eyes. Marcus replied carefully, explaining again that his objection was not about her worthiness but about process and law. A queen consort who ruled wisely was still a great queen, regardless of specific titles. But Eleanor shook her head. She explained that she had not sought this marriage for ambition or power. She had genuinely loved Edmund, had wanted to build a life with him. Yet once she became queen, she had seen so many problems that needed fixing, so much suffering that could be alleviated. The title of Queen Sovereign would give her the authority to make lasting changes, to implement reforms that Edmund supported, but could not pursue alone against noble opposition. Marcus listened, and for the first time, he saw the situation from her perspective. Eleanor was not a power-hungry schemer, but a capable woman frustrated by the limitations placed on her influence. She wanted to help her adopted kingdom, but found herself constrained by traditions that seemed arbitrary. Yet Marcus also knew that good intentions had destroyed kingdoms before. The road to tyranny was often paved with noble goals. He told her something his grandfather had once said. The purpose of law was not to prevent good people from doing good things, but to prevent anyone, good or bad, from doing harmful things. Power needed restraints not because those who held it were evil, but because even the best people could make mistakes. The law existed to catch those mistakes before they became catastrophes. Eleanor was silent for a long moment, considering his words. Then she asked him what he would do if the commission ruled in her favor, if they found legal grounds to support the title change. Marcus answered honestly that he would accept their decision and complete the oath he had previously refused. He served the law, not his personal interpretation of it. If legitimate scholars and legal experts determined that the title was appropriate, he would support it. The queen studied his face, searching for signs of deception or mockery. Finding none, she nodded slowly. She told him that she respected his consistency, even while she disagreed with his conclusions. Then she swept past him down the corridor, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts and the weight of history surrounding him in the ancient archives. Back in the commission chamber, Professor Wilhelm presented his preliminary findings to the assembled scholars. The evidence was overwhelming and consistent. Throughout 7 centuries of history, the title of Queen Sovereign had never been granted by marriage alone. It required either direct inheritance, formal election, or constitutional amendment. There were no exceptions, no precedents that supported the current proclamation. However, the professor also noted that the law did allow for constitutional amendments through a specific process. If the king truly wished to grant this title to his queen, there was a path forward. It would require approval from the Council of Lords, consent from representatives of all 12 provinces, and ratification by the kingdom's high courts. The process would take at least a year, possibly longer, but it could be done legally. This finding represented a middle ground that neither side had fully anticipated. Eleanor could potentially receive her desired title, but only through the proper constitutional channels. It would require patience, political skill, and the genuine support of the broader kingdom. Marcus felt a sense of relief wash over him. The law had provided an answer that honored both tradition and the possibility of change. The commission's preliminary report created shockwaves throughout the kingdom. News spread quickly that while the original proclamation lacked legal foundation, a path existed for Queen Eleanor to legitimately claim the title of Queen Sovereign. The question now became whether King Edmund and his queen would pursue this longer. more difficult process, or accept a compromise that preserved Eleanor's dignity while maintaining constitutional order. The king's reaction was not what Marcus expected. Edmund retreated into private councils with his wife, emerging only for essential state functions. When he did appear, his expression was troubled, torn between his love for Eleanor and his oath to uphold the kingdom's laws. The easy confidence that had always characterized his rule seemed to have deserted him. Queen Eleanor, however, threw herself into a campaign to build support for the constitutional amendment process. She traveled even more extensively, speaking at town halls and noble estates alike. Her message was carefully crafted. She did not attack tradition directly, but argued that the kingdom's law should be flexible enough to recognize merit and capability alongside birthright. The public response was divided in ways that revealed deep tensions within the kingdom. Common people generally supported Eleanor, seeing her as someone who had risen from modest nobility to the highest position through her own abilities. They appreciated her charitable works and her willingness to address problems that previous rulers had ignored. To them, denying her the title seemed like old-fashioned snobbery. But among the nobility and the educated classes, opinion was more mixed. Some saw the legal objections as valid concerns about constitutional order. Others worried that granting the title through the amendment process would still set a dangerous precedent. If Eleanor could become queen sovereign through marriage and political maneuvering, what would stop future monarchs from accumulating power in ways the founders had tried to prevent? Marcus found himself at the center of a storm he had never sought. Some hailed him as a hero who had stood up for principle against powerful interests. Others branded him an obstacle to progress, a rigid traditionalist standing in the way of deserved recognition. He received letters both praising and condemning his actions, some threatening violence if he did not recant his position. The situation grew more complicated when several other guards came forward to support Marcus's stance. Lieutenant Sarah Winters, second in command of the Royal Guard, publicly stated that she too could not recognize the title as originally proclaimed. She was joined by 3 senior sergeants, all of whom had served for over a decade. Their collective refusal could not be easily dismissed or punished without gutting the leadership of the castle's defense. This development infuriated Queen Eleanor's supporters, who saw it as insubordination bordering on rebellion. Lord Blackwood, Eleanor's uncle, demanded that all the dissenting guards be dismissed and replaced with soldiers loyal to the crown. But Lady Ashford countered that loyalty to the crown meant loyalty to its laws, not blind obedience to questionable proclamations. The Council of Lords became paralyzed by debate. Some members wanted to begin the constitutional amendment process immediately, arguing that delay would only increase tensions. Others insisted that more time was needed to fully understand the implications of such a change. A few suggested abandoning the entire effort and allowing Eleanor to remain queen consort, a title that carried considerable honor and influence even without the word sovereign. During this period of uncertainty, an unexpected voice entered the debate. Archbishop Thomas, the kingdom's highest religious authority, requested an audience with the full council. The elderly clergyman had largely stayed out of political matters during his tenure, focusing on spiritual guidance rather than temporal affairs. His decision to speak now commanded attention. The archbishop's message was nuanced and carefully balanced. He praised Queen Eleanor's charitable work and acknowledged her positive impact on the kingdom. But he also warned against allowing passion, even noble passion, to override careful deliberation. He reminded the council that the kingdom's stability rested on the rule of law, not the rule of personalities, however admirable those personalities might be. Moreover, the archbishop raised a point that others had overlooked. If the title of Queen Sovereign was granted to Eleanor through the amendment process, it would apply not just to her but establish a precedent for all future royal marriages. Was the kingdom prepared to potentially have co-monarchs in every generation? What would happen if a future king and queen disagreed on major decisions? These questions demanded answers before any changes were made permanent. The archbishop's intervention shifted the momentum of the debate. Even Eleanor's strongest supporters had to acknowledge that the implications extended far beyond one person or one reign. The discussion began to focus less on whether Eleanor deserved the title and more on whether the kingdom's constitutional structure should be fundamentally altered. Meanwhile, Professor Wilhelm and his commission continued their work, now tasked with not just examining the legality of the original proclamation, but also analyzing what a constitutional amendment might entail. They produced a detailed report outlining the process, the potential consequences, and the historical parallels from other kingdoms that had attempted similar changes. The report made sobering reading. In 7 other kingdoms that had created co-monarchies or expanded royal powers beyond traditional limits, 5 had experienced significant political instability within 2 generations. 2 had descended into civil war. Only 2 had successfully managed the transition, and both had possessed stronger constitutional frameworks and more established traditions of shared governance than Aldermore could claim. Marcus was called to testify before the commission one final time. They asked him what he would recommend if he were making the decision himself. He thought carefully before answering. He said that Queen Eleanor should be honored for her contributions, perhaps through a new title created specifically for her that recognized her role without carrying the constitutional implications of Queen Sovereign. Such a title could acknowledge her partnership with the king, while preserving the legal structures that had maintained stability for centuries. This suggestion sparked intense interest. Several commission members began researching historical precedents for creating new royal titles that carried honor without disrupting constitutional order. They found examples from Aldermore's past, including titles granted to particularly distinguished consorts that recognized their contributions, while maintaining legal clarity about the chain of succession and sovereign authority. As weeks turned into months, the initial fury of the dispute began to cool into more measured consideration. Queen Eleanor continued her work throughout the kingdom, and her popularity remained high. But she also began to understand the genuine concerns that Marcus and others had raised. The law was not simply an obstacle to be overcome, but a framework that protected everyone, including future generations who would live with whatever decisions were made now. King Edmund, for his part, struggled with the realization that his desire to honor his wife might have unintended consequences for the kingdom he had sworn to protect. He spent long hours in the archives reading the same historical documents that Marcus had studied. He began to see that the captain's refusal had not been an act of disrespect, but of loyalty to principles that transcended any individual reign. The kingdom held its breath, waiting to see how this unprecedented situation would be resolved. The commission's final report was due within weeks, and everyone knew that its recommendations would shape not just the present, but the future of Aldermore for generations to come. Marcus continued his duties, standing guard as he always had, but with the awareness that sometimes the hardest service was not defending against external enemies, but standing firm for principles when everyone around you wanted simple answers to complex questions. The final commission report was presented to the Council of Lords on a gray morning in early autumn, exactly 3 months after Marcus's initial refusal. The chamber was packed with nobles, scholars, and observers who understood they were witnessing a pivotal moment in the kingdom's history. Professor Wilhelm stood before them, his weathered face grave as he prepared to deliver findings that had required thousands of hours of research and deliberation. The commission's conclusions were both clear and carefully nuanced. The original proclamation granting Queen Eleanor the title of Queen Sovereign was legally invalid, lacking the constitutional foundation required by 7 centuries of precedent. However, the report acknowledged that the law did provide mechanisms for such a title to be granted through proper channels. The process would require at minimum 2 years of deliberation, approval from multiple bodies of governance, and ratification by representatives from all corners of the kingdom. But the commission did not stop there. Professor Wilhelm presented a third option that his team had developed after extensive research into historical precedents. They proposed the creation of a new title specifically for Queen Eleanor, one that honored her contributions and partnership with the king without carrying the constitutional complications of Queen Sovereign. This title, Queen Protector, had roots in ancient traditions and could be granted through existing legal frameworks. The title of Queen Protector, the professor explained, had been used occasionally throughout the kingdom's history for consorts who took active roles in governance and reform. It carried significant prestige and authority, allowing the holder to exercise real power in matters of charity, justice, and administration. Yet it did not alter the fundamental constitutional structure or create questions about succession and sovereignty. A murmur ran through the chamber as people absorbed this information. Marcus, standing at his post along the wall, felt a cautious hope. This seemed like a solution that could honor both the Queen's achievements and the law's requirements. But the decision ultimately rested with King Edmund and Queen Eleanor, and no one could predict how they would respond. The king requested a recess to confer privately with his wife. The council agreed, and the chamber slowly emptied as nobles and observers filed out to discuss what they had heard. Marcus remained at his post, though no one required his presence. He found he could not leave, could not turn away from the conclusion of a matter that had consumed his life for the past 3 months. 2 hours later, the council reconvened. King Edmund and Queen Eleanor returned to their places, and Marcus noticed something different in their bearing. The tension that had marked their public appearances for months seemed to have eased. They sat close together, their hands briefly touching in a gesture of unity that had been absent during the height of the dispute. King Edmund spoke first, his voice steady and clear. He acknowledged that he had been wrong to attempt to grant the title of Queen Sovereign by proclamation alone. He had acted out of love and admiration for his wife, but he had failed to consider the broader implications for the kingdom's constitutional order. He thanked the commission for their thorough work and for providing alternatives that respected both his intentions and the law. Then Queen Eleanor rose to address the council. Her voice was composed, though Marcus detected emotion beneath the surface. She said that the past months had taught her much about the kingdom she had joined through marriage. She had come to understand that the laws limiting royal power existed not to diminish rulers, but to protect the people. A strong kingdom required not just capable leaders, but frameworks that ensured continuity and stability beyond any single reign. Eleanor announced that she would accept the title of Queen Protector, embracing it not as a compromise but as a recognition of her true role in the kingdom. She did not seek to rule as a sovereign, but to serve as a guardian of the people's welfare, a position that aligned with her charitable works and reform efforts. The title carried authority sufficient to accomplish her goals without disrupting the constitutional structures that had maintained peace for centuries. The relief in the chamber was palpable. Council members who had been deeply divided found themselves united in support of this resolution. Lord Pemberton moved to formally grant the title of Queen Protector, and the motion passed unanimously. For the first time in months, the kingdom's leadership stood together without fracture or division. After the vote, Queen Eleanor did something unexpected. She requested that Captain Marcus Thornfield approach the throne. Marcus felt every eye in the chamber turn toward him as he stepped forward and knelt before the king and queen. His heart pounded, uncertain what would come next. Had she forgiven his role in opposing her, or did she intend some final rebuke? Eleanor spoke directly to him, her words carrying through the silent chamber. She said that she had been angry with him, had seen his refusal as a personal insult and an obstacle to her ambitions. But time and reflection had shown her that Marcus had acted not from malice but from principle. He had risked his position and reputation to defend the law, even when that meant standing against those he served. Such loyalty to principle was rare and valuable. The Queen asked Marcus if he could now, in good conscience, swear the oath of recognition for her new title. Marcus looked up, meeting her gaze directly. He said that he could and would, for the title of Queen Protector was granted through proper legal channels and carried no constitutional conflicts. He would serve her as faithfully as he served the king, would defend her with his life, and would honor her authority in all matters within her jurisdiction. Marcus spoke the oath clearly and without hesitation, his voice carrying the weight of genuine commitment. When he finished, Eleanor extended her hand for him to kiss in the traditional gesture of fealty. But instead of the formal, distant touch such moments usually involved, she gripped his hand firmly and helped him to his feet, a gesture of respect between equals who had found common ground through difficult struggle. King Edmund then addressed Marcus directly, thanking him for his service and his courage. The king admitted that Marcus's refusal, though initially painful, had saved them all from a mistake that could have had serious consequences. By insisting that proper procedures be followed, the captain had protected not just the law but the monarchy itself from the kind of overreach that had destroyed kingdoms in the past. In the weeks that followed, a grand ceremony was held to formally invest Eleanor with the title of Queen Protector. The event was attended by nobles and commoners alike, and the celebration was genuine. Eleanor had proven herself worthy of honor through her actions, and the kingdom had proven its commitment to constitutional order. Both outcomes strengthened Aldermore in ways that neither could have achieved alone. Marcus returned to his regular duties, but something had changed. His fellow guards treated him with a new respect, recognizing that he had faced a test that went beyond physical courage. He had stood for principle when it would have been easier to simply obey, had chosen law over expedience, and had done so knowing the personal cost might be severe. Queen Eleanor threw herself into her role as Queen Protector with even greater energy than before. She expanded her charitable networks, reformed corrupt practices in provincial governance, and established new institutions to serve the people. Her authority in these matters was unquestioned, supported by both law and the genuine affection of those she served. She had found that real power came not from titles claimed, but from trust earned. The relationship between Eleanor and Marcus evolved into one of mutual respect. They would never be friends in the traditional sense, their roles and positions too different for easy familiarity. But they understood each other in a way that few others could. Both had chosen duty over personal desire. Both had stood for principles that transcended individual ambition. In a kingdom where such qualities were rare, this created a bond stronger than friendship. Years later, when historians wrote about this period, they would call it the constitutional crisis of King Edmund's reign. But those who lived through it knew it as something more nuanced. It was a moment when the kingdom had to choose between the easy path of personal loyalty and the harder path of principled governance. The choice they made, difficult as it was, set a precedent that would guide Aldermore for generations to come. Marcus would serve King Edmund for another 20 years, eventually retiring with full honors to a small estate near the capital. But he never forgot those crucial months when he had been forced to choose between the person of the king and the principles of the crown. The experience taught him that true loyalty sometimes meant saying no, that real service sometimes required resistance, and that the highest form of devotion to a kingdom was devotion to the laws that made it just and sustainable. Queen Eleanor would go on to be remembered as one of the most effective and beloved queens in Aldermore's history. Her title of Queen Protector became prestigious in its own right, eventually surpassing Queen Consort as the designation most associated with active, engaged partnership in governance. Future generations would see the wisdom in creating a title that recognized capability without disrupting constitutional balance, a solution that honored both tradition and merit. The story became part of the